A recent interaction involving Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland and a man in Alberta is the latest example of the growing issue of harassment and violence against politicians. A video circulating online over the weekend shows the finance minister being confronted by a man hurling profanity at her. This came as she arrived at the City Hall in Grand Prairie, Alberta. On Sunday, she recounted numerous incidents in which she said she was fearful. This includes a phone call from a man who said he knew where she lived and that she should, quote, watch out. The PM points out that this was not a one-time incident, but something that people in the public, particularly women and minorities, are having to deal with more and more. Well, joining us now to talk more on this is Dr. Barbara Perry, professor at Ontario Tech University and director of the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism. Dr. Perry, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Good to be with you again.
So how do such incidents, including what happened to Ms. Freeland, contribute to the rise of extremism in Canada?
Well, I think it's a chicken and egg. I think that the rise of extremism has allowed this sort of narrative to flourish, that it's not just people who are formally affiliated with far-right groups who find themselves or feel themselves to be emboldened, but in fact, common citizens, everyday citizens that aren't necessarily affiliated. So that's, that's feeding into their narratives, but then that is reinforcing, I think, the strength of the far-right movement generally.
And going back to a press conference on Monday, we saw federal cabinet ministers saying such incidents are a threat to democracy. But what is the current state of democracy in Canada amid this growing issue of violence and harassment against politicians?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, if we look at the last election, the voter turnout was not great. So I think that's an indication. I think that there was just what were they calling it? The rage index that was just released in the last week or so that shows a lot of dissatisfaction with the state of government. And I think that we hear, in social media forums, a lot of distrust of public institutions, including politics and politicians. So I think that, we're at a different space than we've ever been in that respect. I think there is less legitimacy, less credibility on the part of many people in terms of the way that they view the government and their role. Some people feel left behind, as they say, by the government.
And what's interesting is that officials are highlighting that most of these incidents involve women, racialized people, and Indigenous people. So why do you think that is, Dr. Perry?
Yeah, and that's another piece of the threat to democracy. It is exclusionary. It's intended to silence these people. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we saw, Singh assailed earlier last year in Peterborough. We have seen this with politicians and journalists as well, people of color, women, who are seen to be, that's just one more indication of what's wrong with this society, with this culture, that, that they are also jumping the queue somehow, that they have stepped outside of the boundaries that are acceptable, and they need to be silenced again from their perspective. They need to be put back in those boxes that have been crafted for them. So it is a reaction not just to lack of faith in government, but also it's a reflection of misogyny. It's a reflection of the racism that's embedded in our society.
And what do we know so far about the demographics of the perpetrators of such violence and harassment in Canada?
Well, so far it looks as if it is predominantly white men and not necessarily young white men. When we think about the far right, when we think about extremists, I think we think that that is a youth movement. It's really not. We're seeing, I think, much more in the way of middle-aged and older individuals who are being drawn into these same sorts of narratives and ideologies and acting on them in this way. And so this is who we're seeing is that demographic, middle class, working class, middle class white men predominantly.
And I guess the big question here would be if this is an issue that our leaders or Canadians themselves need to address, Dr. Perry. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, that's part of the problem is that our political leaders are also engaging in some of this polarizing speech. So they're certainly not helping. I think they are exacerbating the problem in many respects. So I think that, we do have to hold those leaders accountable and demand that they not only speak out when they see these sorts of incidents, but also themselves refrain from language that others people, language that is polarizing polarizing in any way, because that just further aggravates the grievances and especially the concerns around democracy and the role of the government.
All right, Dr. Barbara Perry, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
It's good to be with you.
Stay with us on Forum Daily. When we return, we're taking a look at the cost of climate disasters on the Canadian economy, and we'll review a recently published Aquanomics report. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.